All right, that is the theme song, and I am your host, Kenneth Arthur, for Real on the Field Goals. It is June 11th, 2015. Seahawks are wrapping up their they're wrapping up this week of OTAs and then a mandatory mini camp coming up next as the media and the fans and everyone gets just a peek at what's been going on in practices, but not a whole lot more outside of that. As with me as always is Danny Kelly. Actually, let me scratch that out. With me this week is Danny Kelly. With me this week, Rob Staton of Seahawks Draft Blog. Rob, how's it going?
This is good. You can call me not Danny Kelly if you want for the episode, if that helps.
It does help, not Danny Kelly. So, of course,
I love the theme tune. By the way, last time I was on, the theme tune was dun-dun-dun, dun-dun-dun. So
yeah, we had to scrap that one, but.
Yeah.
But so David Fagerholm, a listener, sent that in. It was the winner by means of not having any other competitors, but also a very catchy, nice tune, I think. So it fits well, and I like listening to it. So as I've been mentioning, the Seahawks, they're wrapping up OTAs. Last night, the NFL Top 100 continued, and Kam Chancellor came in at number 41. I mean, when you think about it, 41, if there was a way to legitimize this Top 100 and say that this is really what players are, and I don't think that there is ever going to be a way to do that. But if you were really to say that Kam Chancellor is the 41st best player in the NFL, then you're saying that theoretically, Kam Chancellor would be the second best player on just about any team and the best player on a number of teams as well. And to think about how far he's come from 2010 when he played well, and then there were the years when he didn't play as well, and then over these last 2 years just really come on as maybe, definitely one of the most exciting defensive players to watch in the NFL. The Seahawks have arguably the top two safeties in the entire league, which is just insane, especially considering, their three of their four players in the secondary are going to be in the top 41 of the NFL Top 100. It's absolutely insane. Rob, can you kind of reflect back on Kam Chancellor coming out of Virginia Tech, where he was seen? Obviously he went in the 5th round, kind of a tweener with his size. Where was he going to play? And now he's developed into almost a new position, a new force that we don't really have ever seen at strong safety. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that when he was at Virginia Tech, the big thing was the size stood out. And he was a tweener, like you say. I mean, a lot of people thought he was going to end up playing linebacker just because he was so big. You don't expect, or if you put yourself back in 2010, what did a safety look like? And it wasn't Kam Chancellor. So a lot of people were saying he's too stiff, too big to work in coverage, that he'll be a liability in the secondary. But if you put him up in the box, then he's a real force. What we're seeing in the NFL with Kam Chancellor is it's kind of what you saw in college. Real hard-hitting, big physical safety. So you put him up in the box, and he's physical there. And there was a suggestion that he could perhaps move to linebacker instead. Now, I remember at the time looking back at the 2010 draft, and we were talking to people who were USC fans and what we should expect. This was going to be Pete Carroll's first draft. And they talked about sort of this big athletic safety that he liked to use. And he'd had Taylor Mays at USC. And a lot of people wondered whether or not Mays was going to be a first-round pick in Seattle. I think that his stock dropped just before the draft, so nobody really expected him to go in round 1. Mm-hmm. But you wondered whether or not he could have been a target in round 2, which is where he eventually went. I think it was to San Francisco in the end, wasn't it? But that you could see that they wanted that type of player. And Kam Chancellor, a little bit later on in the draft, in the 5th round, good place to take him. They sat him obviously behind Lawyer Milloy. They obviously wanted to work on a few things with him, unlike a lot of other rookies who they just threw straight in there. They actually took their time with Kam Chancellor, let him develop, I think, as a person more so than a player, let him come out of his shell a little bit, gave him responsibilities on special teams. And the reward for that was just a tremendous player in his second year who took big steps forward every year. And I think 41 is a very fair position. When Kam Chancellor is at his best, Kenny, the Seattle defense just seems to be that little bit better. And if you look back at the games when Seattle was going through a tough spot, and I was at the Dallas game, and Kam Chancellor was not healthy in that game, and you could just see the impact he had on the defense. He has grown into a really key player. Had a fantastic postseason, didn't he, when Seattle won the Super Bowl? where he was just making plays in every game.
Yeah.
I mean, he had the big touchdown return against Carolina in this year's playoffs as well. He's just become such a vital player for Seattle.
Yeah, and getting hurt right before the Super Bowl, just another sort of it just terrible timing and unfortunate. And then it all showed up when he had all three of those guys hurt in the Super Bowl, and then Jeremy Lane, obviously his injury going on in the Super Bowl. That secondary. It's amazing that they came that close to winning it all with those guys at maybe 60, 70, 80%, which their 80% is still better than almost everyone else's 100%. Speaking of which, Earl Thomas not participating in OTAs this week. Deshaun Shedd, he's going into another year with Seattle, obviously fighting for, to be the main backup. Do you have any thoughts on Shedd's progression and, if he could be the type of guy that would fill in admirably at either safety spot?
Well, potentially. I know that they talked about him as a possible kind of swing. Can he play corner? Can he play a bit of safety? And maybe that flexibility is something that they like. Obviously, they've drafted a couple of safeties as well, or players that can play in that kind of range. So, you're looking at a real healthy competition in there. They've got to replace Jerron Johnson as well, who was kind of the primary replacement if Chancellor ever goes down. And with Earl Thomas being banged up, this is an area that they seem to put a fair amount of attention in. And let's see how it goes. Let's get into training camp. Let's see which one of these guys stands up. There's a few guys competing for those spots at safety, and I'm sure that Deshaun Shedd, we've seen very little of him in actual gameplay to actually be able to judge him. But let's see if he can maybe put his head above the parapet there and make sure that he is the guy who lasts through and is considered to be Chancellor's primary safety, because there is backup. Because there is one issue here, is that Chancellor has banged up a little bit. And I think if you're that big and you're going to play the style that he does, he's going to pick up injuries. I don't think that's going to stop. So they do need somebody who can fill in competently. You're not going to replace Kam Chancellor, but they need someone who, if he's going to play 2 or 3 games or spell him during a game, he has to be up to the mark.
Yeah, not to get philosophical, but just talking about these guys like Chancellor and Thomas and Sherman, and it's kind of phenomenal, isn't it, that we're now talking about, 2 guys that have put in 5 years in their league, going into their 6th year, and Sherman going into his 5th. I can't believe that Thomas and Chancellor have been around for already 5 years now. It seems like just yesterday we were trying to figure out this whole Pete Carroll era, and now, those guys, for them to play every single game for 5 years, I mean, the wear and tear, it does sort of scare you a little bit, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, when you bring it up like that, yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, Kam Chancellor was 27 this year. Is he the kind of player, who's going to play well into his 30s? I'm not sure that he is. And this is, I hope he does. We all hope that he does. But could you see him 32, 33, still lining up there and playing the physical style that he is now? I'm not entirely sure. And it may be that in 2 or 3 years' time, we're talking about an era beyond Kam Chancellor, and Richard Sherman has gone from, hey, look, there's that 5th round pick who's doing ever so well for Seattle, and he's the best corner in the league, and he's got all this to prove. And now, what is he? He's one of the best paid corners in the league. He's been on the Madden cover. He's a Super Bowl winner, and he's an established player. And we are right in the middle of Seattle. This is why we're in the middle of Seattle's window. It's why they're going and trading for Jimmy Graham, because while ever you want to build and you want to do it, Seattle's got about 3, 4, 5 years here where they need to win as many championships as possible, because in a few years' time, all these key players that we're talking about, we take for granted right now, that are part of this team that they did so well to pick up in the later rounds, they're going to be the other side of their peak, perhaps. So this is why Seattle has to be aggressive now, and they have to try and win as many titles as possible over these next few years.
Yeah, and why they've got to have good draft classes, as we've seen in San Francisco. When those players go out, whether it's early or late, San Francisco doesn't have a lot to show for their 2012, 2013, 2014 drafts. So the Seahawks, they hit big in 10, 11, 12. Doesn't look like, we haven't seen a lot from 13 and 14, and we have no idea what to expect from 15. But it's going to be something interesting to watch. So that's why a lot of the times they find guys that aren't even draft considered. I almost wanted to say draft eligible. They were draft eligible, but nobody cared. Speaking of those lines, Chris Matthews, he comes in, he has over 100 yards in the Super Bowl. I've heard that he's looked good so far this year. And is this a guy that could be starting come week 1?
I'm dubious of that. And I want to believe in Matthews and believe that the Super Bowl wasn't just a one-off. But there's a few things that sort of bring you back, and the first one is that either Seattle made a mistake last year in just not using him at all until the final game of the Super Bowl. Or the other way of looking at it is that maybe the Super Bowl was just an anomaly and a bit of a fluke, and Seattle tried something, it worked, they kept going with it. I mean, Matthews, from what I remember, was bossing some smaller cornerbacks in the Patriots secondary, and then came up against Brandon Browner a couple of times, maybe on the last drive, and wasn't having quite as much success. And if teams, he was a real secret weapon for Seattle. Oh, look, here's Matthews. You've probably not even studied any tape on this guy to prepare for him, and now we're going to throw him out there. Maybe that was intentional. Maybe Seattle thought, hey, we'll just try this. If it gets to a certain point in the game, we'll see if we can just bring him around the back and just sort of unleash him maybe on the Patriots. Can he do it, in week one when they're taking on St. Louis, or in the second week against Green Bay, when they've maybe had a bit of a chance to think about how they're going to manage a guy like Chris Matthews? Is he going to have the same success? I really hope so. But I also think that this is a team that doesn't throw that often. And Jimmy Graham is going to take up an awful lot of the targets in this offense. I think there's going to be a focus towards Graham. I think that Russell Wilson may even force it to Graham a little bit to really get him involved early on. Doug Baldwin's still going to get his looks. So is Jermaine Kearse. I think that Tyler Lockett's going to be involved. Let's see if Richardson can get back at any point soon. And there's one or two others. I mean, I think they're going to use Luke Wilson. I don't think he's just going to disappear because Jimmy Graham's suddenly arrived on the scene.
Right.
So, how many targets are there to throw around? And, to have a big target outside like Matthews would be useful, but I'm just not sure whether or not there's going to be the targets for everybody there to make sure that he becomes, a real big weapon for Seattle.
Yeah, and it's sort of a question of any wide receiver when you're looking for one. It's, Matthews, he might be able to go up and bully for – come up with his frame and come down with some 30-yard throw down field, and that's nice and all, but, would you rather have a guy that can sometimes make a big catch or can reliably make a bunch of 10-yard catches? And, that's why some of the problems that I've had with Jermaine Kearse over the years is he comes into playoffs and he catches these game-winning touchdowns, and it makes you, want to have him around, but at the same time, can you rely on him as a guy that's someone that should get 90 to 100 targets, and there's reasons why he isn't reliable in that way. So to have someone...
with the greatest respect to the Super Bowl plays, Kenny, was there an element of flukiness about some of them? I mean, it was kind of just like Russell Wilson threw it up and he went up and made the play. Right. I mean, if that happens, let's say they did that for 10 weeks, how many of those weeks does he have 100-yard games? I mean, he's not Mike Evans. So,
right.
Was there a degree of, oh, look, he's made another play. Wow, he's having a great game. But, is he going to do that every week? I'm not too sure.
He'll be competing against Tyler Lockett for targets, another guy that's out there. Looks like Lockett, he's going to be a no question punt returner, kick returner, from day one. Seems like it's solid in there. Do you think that there's a good chance that, Evans is going to work his way, or Lockett is going to work his way? I was almost for a second there wishing we had Mike Evans.
Hey, if only.
If only. Could Tyler Lockett be working his way in there and maybe get up to number 2 on the depth chart or something?
Oh, this is an interesting one because I think that Seattle are pretty honest when they're asked questions, or at least Pete Carroll is. And the language used, you can obviously read a lot into it. And I think when they drafted Tyler Lockett, they were quite clear initially to say, this guy is going to be our punt kick returner. We're going to throw him out there and try and get him involved in that really quickly. There was no sort of suggestion, oh, you know what? He's also going to be a key figure in the offense. So I think that we can read somewhat into that and believe that his role primarily in year one is going to be as a punt and kick returner. However, I just think that there's just something about the guy. There's just a little spark, his attitude. I cannot imagine that he's going to be, if he was told, oh, by the way, Tyler, you're just going to be the kick returner this year, that he's going to be satisfied with that or accept that at all. And I think it may be a situation where he forces Seattle over training camp and the preseason and maybe the first few weeks of the year to use him a little bit more. So I don't think in week one we should expect Tyler Lockett to be heavily involved, much more than just returning kicks. But I think as the season develops, we might start to see his role increase. But I think that a safe estimate would be to kind of expect the same time of rookie season that maybe Richardson had last year, which is start almost anonymously in terms of the offense, but gradually the role develops. And by the end of the year, you're feeling very optimistic about what he can do.
Yeah. And speaking of anonymous, moving on to Drew Novak. He was taking snaps with a lot of the ones this week on the offensive line at center. Center's been the biggest position of question so far, how they're going to replace Max Unger. And it seems like, at this point, you can't really read into anything, but Novak, for him to go up there, here's a guy that was undrafted in 2012. Wouldn't you know it, he was a defensive tackle in college, and then he went to the Jaguars for 2 years, and now he's with the Seahawks, and he switched over to the offensive line. Do you know anything else about Novak? Any thoughts on his stature compared to the other guys?
Well, I know that he was quite an accomplished defensive tackle and won awards when he was at Western Michigan.
2011 MAC Defensive Player of the Year.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't a slouch at Western Michigan, but they've used the classic convert. We're seeing more and more these days, and we're going to see even more. It's going to happen in college, Kenny, as much as it happens in the NFL, because the defensive linemen in both levels are just becoming so athletic right now. The only way you can combat that is to put defensive linemen on your offensive line. And I think that's part of why Seattle is going for sort of big athletic guys who they can mold using Tom Cable, because they understand that if you are drafting conventional interior linemen who play college, they're just not athletic enough to deal with the brutes that you're facing in the NFL, which is, I think, the plan that Seattle has got with these incredible athletes, Sokoli being given a chance to play center. I think that I can't help but be a little bit concerned, though, because you look across the team and you say, wow, how good does the defense look right now? And you've got all these star players, and they've added to that with Frank Clark in the draft and a few others. You're thinking, yeah, you feel really good about the depth and the talent on the defense. Then you look in the offense, you say, well, you've got Russell Wilson, you've got Jimmy Graham, you've got Marshawn Lynch, you've got all of the other weapons that were there from last year. Not a lot's changed. And then you look at the offensive line and you suddenly think, do you know what? If there's one area in the team that just looks like a bit of a concern, it's that. And, I believe in Tom Cable, as everybody should, because he's a fantastic coach. But is it just a little bit of a concern that they're going to go to St. Louis in the first week of the season and potentially roll out a guy like Drew Novak as the starting center, or, Sokoli or somebody like that? That just worries me a little bit. That interior line against Aaron Donald and Michael Brockers and some of the other guys. They brought in Nick Fairley as well, and the edge rush that they've got in St. Louis. And I just fear that there's going to be some growing pains there, whoever they start at center and guard, and that it could hurt Seattle. It could cost them a couple of games early on. But I think maybe as soon as they get to weeks 4, 5, 6, maybe they'll have got into their stride. But it does scare me to think who is going to be lining up on that interior offensive line in 2 huge games to start the year against St. Louis and Green Bay. Let's be realistic here. There's every chance Seattle could be, it wouldn't be insane if Seattle was 0-2 to start the year. And that's with an accomplished defensive line. With a makeshift one, I don't know. There's a bit of a concern there for me.
I think I just heard a bunch of people turning off the podcast as soon as they even the mention of 0-2. But of course, it's tough. And don't worry, 0-2, not a death knell. There's plenty of teams that come back from that. But is there any more difficulty, do you think, switching? Let's say you were switching over from a nose tackle to just the other side of the ball, and you were familiar with that. Do you think it's that much more difficult? We also know that Mark Glowinski took snaps at center this week. Is it could you compare sort of, you think, going from nose tackle to center than like a Sokoli or Novak compared to going from guard to center? Do you think it's just as difficult?
Well, I think that the one thing that Glowinski will have the benefit is that he will have a basic understanding of what the job entails. I mean, he'll have stood next to a center throughout his college career. And he will have some grasp of the basic concepts. Whereas I imagine someone, especially like Sokoli, who's relatively raw to the game and will be learning this from scratch. They've got center's a key position, and while it is possible, and we've seen teams roll out sort of mid-late round centers and start them as rookies in recent years, you've got to know the calls. You've got to have great awareness. You've got to be able to snap a football. I mean, let's not underestimate that. You've got to be able to snap the football consistently well.
Yeah.
And when Max Unger went out, I want to say, was it the Philadelphia game? There was one game away on the road last year where Unger went out, and I don't think Jean-Pierre was around. And the guy snapping the ball, it may have been St. Louis actually. It was horrific, and it was a mess. And Seattle was a risk to turn the ball over every time the damn thing was snapped. And these are the kind of basic qualities that if you've just not done it before, you're going to have to learn. And the defensive guys, I would hazard a guess that maybe Glowinski has snapped a few balls in college or whatever. The defensive guys are going to have to learn it. And for me, I would feel a lot better about this situation is if very early on in training camp, someone established themselves as, oh, this is the guy. This is the center. This is who we're going to invest the time in now. He's separated himself from the rest, so they can really focus on it. Because as much as you want competition, I think that is a position you really want to work with one guy in particular. So I hope that pretty early on, somebody plays so well in camp that they just have to give him the job.
A couple of guys that are playing well from what I've read. I read Stephen Cohen of the PI's piece this week where he was able to speak a little bit on what had happened in that one day of open practice. Two guys that he had sort of praised were Deshaun Fox, a wide receiver that had made a nice catch, and Steven Terrell. Obviously, these guys, they don't have that much to work with. There's a lot of different players out there, but Steven Terrell also apparently looking good, and maybe could work his way up above Shed into that third place. We know Terrell because he was with the team last year. He was active for the Super Bowl. Can you give any thoughts at all on Deshaun Fox, if you know anything about him, and if you think Terrell is a guy that could work his way up to, possibly taking that third role?
Well, Deshaun Fox is a real box of tricks, isn't he? And he did a bit of everything in UConn, and I think there were packages where he threw the football, and his coach commented on how well he throws the ball, and he trick plays and stuff like that. And while there were, you would imagine that because Seattle didn't draft the big guy, they'd be looking at maybe sort of another Chris Matthews project, for example, that they could bring in. They actually brought in, this guy who is a lot smaller. I just think that maybe he's a kick return specialist as well. Maybe they wanted another guy who could just keep Tyler Lockett on his toes and not presume that he's just going to take that job uncontested. Maybe they wanted someone in there who could spell Lockett for whatever reason. I mean, if he makes it as far as training camp, for example, in a preseason game, if they don't want Tyler Lockett taking loads and loads of kick returns and punt returns in the second half of like the first game, the fourth game, then maybe they want somebody else who can do that. Maybe that's what Fox can do. I mean, the chances of him making the team are slim, but you just wonder whether they see a little spark in this guy. He's a bit of a playmaker, can do a lot of different things and trick plays, whether they think he's someone they could stash on a practice squad or have a look at over a few years. Of course, they've done that with other wide receivers, put them on a practice squad, released them, brought them into the roster and done things like that in the past. So maybe that's going to happen with Fox again. As for Terrell, a guy who played in the Dallas game, if I'm not mistaken. So what I remember about him, Kenny, is when Seattle's secondary was decimated in that game, kind of watching it through my fingers in central infield. Bearing in mind, I've traveled thousands of miles to watch this game, and it was a good game, but ultimately ended in disappointment. Every time Tony Romo shot back, he just, you were fearful. And whilst Terrell, I would put it this way, I really hope he has a fantastic summer and a great training camp. But I really hope that it doesn't come to the point where we're relying on him at any point next year.
Right. Yeah, it's. I don't think that there's those certain positions where it's nice to have a good backup. But at the same time, you hope you literally never hear their names called and don't have to think about them all season long. I want to move on to college football a little bit. It's something that I don't get that much time to spend on, and I would like to know more. And there's a lot of interesting things going on in college football right now. Probably none bigger than Ohio State. Who, I've been over the last few days sort of working on some stuff that involved looking ahead to the next couple of drafts over the following couple of years for something I wrote on Sports on Earth this week, and it's kind of insane that the Ohio State Buckeyes could have 3 quarterbacks that could be NFL starters. Is that right?
Yeah, it's possible. I'm not entirely optimistic on any of them, to be brutally honest. And Braxton Miller is mobile, gets around, makes plays, but a marginal pro prospect, you'd have to say. JT Barrett, likewise, a nice player to watch in college and can certainly win a football game for a team. And could you imagine him as a franchise quarterback? I'd have to say no. And then you've got Cardale Jones, and if people will have seen Jones playing in the college playoffs, Kenny, and in the Big Ten championship, and they'll be going, wow, this guy could be a number one pick because he was doing it all. He's mobile enough to get away from pressure, was getting a few yards with his legs, huge arm, throwing it downfield, leading Ohio State to an unlikely championship, and you think, yeah, this guy's got it. And then you realize that, but he was third on the depth chart going into the season for a reason. Yeah. He was third on the depth chart, and he's not a freshman. This is a guy who could have declared for the draft this year. He's been stuck on the depth chart at Ohio State for a few years. He was tweeting stuff like, why do I have to go to school? I'm a football player. I don't want to go to class anymore. Right. Which is not a big deal. I can't say that I didn't complain a lot about when I was at university about having to get up after a long night out or something, having to get up the next day and go and go to class, because you've got to remember in England the legal drinking age is 18. So
journalism major?
Yes, absolutely. But you could go to the pub for a whole night, and then it'd be a little difficult to get up for your lectures the next day. So we've all been there. But as a guy who harbors ambitions of going to the NFL, wasn't the wisest thing to tweet. It exploded, of course.
I mean, if you can imagine the fact that we're living in an era with social media, I mean, if you could take the Twitter and Facebook and push them back to 1920, we're not necessarily seeing anything different from a Cardale Jones that we might have seen from, a Dick Butkus or, whatever, if we went back and actually put a microscope on some of these guys from the past, right?
Well, could you imagine what a drunken young teenage Winston Churchill would have tweeted out? I can only imagine. So, it's a great point. But and I agree with you. The point that you're making there, Kenny. And these are kids, and they should be allowed to make mistakes. I mean, I did stupid things when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, and Cardale Jones has made a tweet. It's hardly the biggest crime in the world. But you know what it's like. Teams are going to look at stuff like that and go, So, and look, let's talk about his game. I mean, as a football player, he's pretty good. But one, he has to win the job at Ohio State. He's got two other guys competing with him. And when he wins the job, he's going to be expected to be brilliant. He's going to be expected to be a Heisman candidate because of what he did at the end of last year. If he does it, if he wins the job and he plays like he did, he could be a first-round pick. But I just come back to there had to be a reason why someone as smart as Urban Meyer had this guy at number 3 on his depth chart.
Are you seeing any sort of Russell Wilsons out there? That is to say, quarterbacks, new school, new opportunity, about to blow up.
Well, I think the obvious one will be Vernon Adams, wouldn't it? And just because of the way that he played at a smaller school, and now has the chance to go and play with the behemoth that is Oregon and the talent around him. Now, I like the fact that he's going to get this opportunity because, one, he looked the part. You watched him play, especially in the games against Washington, and you think, yeah, do you know what? There's just something about him. And because he's at the small school, you kind of doubt yourself. Well, now any of those questions that people had about how good is this guy, we're going to find out next year when he's at Oregon. If he can lead this team and maybe do what Marcus Mariota couldn't do and lead them to a title, then, people are going to be talking about this guy. He's very talented, similar, smaller stature and frame. Whether he's got the arm talent of a Russell Wilson remains to be seen. But, he's a sparky little player. So let's see if he can do it with Oregon. He's probably the most fascinating thing for me about the Pac-12 next year.
Yeah, I don't even know that much about him until just a second, and now I want to watch an Oregon game and sort of find out who this Vernon Adams guy is. The other guy, obviously he's replacing Marcus Mariota, and the guy that went ahead of Mariota was Jameis Winston. So who's stepping in for Winston at Florida State, and is that guy going to be any good?
Well, it's going to be tough because Florida State have got, they've had EJ Manuel and they've had Jameis Winston, and there isn't really anybody out there right now. I mean, I think the guy that is they were talking about maybe transferring someone over. I think Sean McGuire is the incumbent, but there is no way they're going to be able to replace Jameis Winston. And the great thing about Winston that you would have to say is that he put himself in some really difficult situations last year where Florida State probably should have lost a couple of games, and they dragged themselves out of it and somehow found a way to win. A lot of that was on Winston because he'd put them in a hole and then he'd dig them out of it again. And it's pretty difficult for whoever comes in. They're going to have to play at a certain level. I don't think that Florida State. I think there's every chance they're going to revert back to the pre-Winston Florida State, and that is going to be a team that probably does well enough to win the ACC, or at least compete with the likes of Clemson. But ultimately, they're not going to be a national title contender.
So, and some of the other guys that I know that I've heard about, Christian Hackenberg, Connor Cook, seems like there's a lot of flawed guys perhaps going into this upcoming college football season, what will be the NFL draft. Who are the guys that you sort of like?
Well, Connor Cook, I think, is a little bit overrated, and he has that sort of classic Michigan State quarterback feel about him in that, he's okay, but I don't know. There's just not anything really special about him. And, he's not somebody, I don't think he's a cerebral kind of quarterback where you say, okay, you can really build behind this guy and he's going to lead you to wins for many years. I think that Hackenberg just needs to, whatever he did last year, and there was a new coaching staff at Penn State, and that's been a bit of a mess, that school for a while. It needs stability. Whatever happens there, the new coach has got to get an angle on him because he had a tremendous first year, a pretty poor second year, and the talent is there, but the kind of decision making and mistakes he made last year were horrendous, quite frankly. So if he's going to have any chance of delivering on his potential, he needs a big time bounce back year. But it's such a tough place for that to happen. It may have been best if he transferred when Bill O'Brien left. I think that may have been the best thing for him.
Yeah, it's super weird to even think of, as good as Penn State, as storied as their history is, it's super weird to hear about a quarterback coming out of there. Is that going to be a sort of a change, do you think, where, it's like Alabama doesn't produce quarterbacks. Do you think that any of these teams will sort of transition to, a more quarterbacks heavy or centric offense, since we've seen, guys like, as example, last year's championship games where you had Cardale Jones, Jameis Winston, and Marcus Mariota, all going at it. And Alabama doesn't really have any sort of quarterback to ever really hang their hat on. So do you think that teams will start to transition to passing just like the NFL has?
Possibly. There's many ways you can do it. I mean, you can be a big, heavy run-first team and just ask your quarterback not to make mistakes, which is essentially what Michigan State do, and they seem to win a lot of football games with not prolific quarterback play. Alabama's done that a bit, but now they've got Lane Kiffin, and more teams find they love to spread it around the field, Kenny. And what they'll do is they'll have a quarterback do a 7-step drop from the gun, just sort of allow the offensive line to drop and almost put you're sitting really deep at that point, and it just opens up the entire field, and you can throw crossing routes all day. The spread systems that you see at Baylor, for example, that illuminate passing games, and you don't even have to make many reads. You don't have a playbook. It just makes life so much easier on the signal caller, and it's about getting talent at receiver. And I think what we're actually seeing, and we're seeing this in the NFL as well, that teams are really valuing quality at receiver. And you think back to those Oklahoma State teams when they were doing really well and on the national scene with Brandon Weeden and people like that as quarterback. They were dropping really deep using those spread systems, but they always had like a Des Bryant or a Justin Blackman who could really exploit it. So if you can open up the field, and then you've got the talent at receiver to make the most of it and win one-on-one battles and run over the middle and make big plays and has got size, I think you're going to see more and more of a shift towards that. Quarterbacks who can do the job within the system and receivers that can dominate. And I think it's part of the reason why at the moment we're seeing so many good receivers coming into the NFL.
Yeah, just a shitload.
To put it mildly,
beyond just a Heisman watch list, like, who are some names at any position, whatever, but who are some names that you can't wait to see play college football again?
The number one name is Harold Brantley, and he's a 3 technique from Missouri. And I cannot believe that nobody is talking about him, Kenny. I mean, I've read countless mock projections for 2016 and a lot of like, hey, there's a watch list and stuff like that. And I hardly ever see Harold Brantley's name on here. And if you watched Missouri last year, they had a tremendous defensive line. It wasn't just Shane Ray and Marcus Golden. They had interior guys who were causing havoc all the time. And for me, even made life fairly easy for those edge rushers. And Brantley was just one of those. He's great size, works well in the run, just lives in the backfield, finds a way to make plays. He's not Sheldon Richardson. It'd be unfair to compare anybody to Sheldon Richardson, but they impact games in exactly the same way. And I'm really excited about seeing Harold Brantley. I think that he's got everything you want from a potential first-round pick, interior pass rusher. I'm very excited about seeing him. He's the number one. But this is a really exciting draft. You've got a lot of good offensive tackles, which could be important for Seattle, depending on what they do with Russell Okung. There's more good receivers. Surprise, surprise. Tyler Boyd at Pittsburgh is a really exciting player to watch, and he's not a big guy, incredibly talented, finds ways to make plays. He's not Percy Harvin as much as he's not a big guy, but you kind of see some of those similar athletic qualities in here. And the size as well. I mean, you've got Darunya Wilson, if he cleans up his act, Duke Williams at Auburn. You've got the guy at Ole Miss, Laquan Treadwell. If he comes back from a horrendous injury that he picked up at the end of last season, then he's got a chance to be a big player. A lot of good cornerbacks, good running backs. This is shaping up to be a really intriguing draft.
The top, just going back to Ohio State, they could have the top running back in the country too, couldn't they?
Yeah, Zeke Elliott's a tremendous player, not the biggest guy, but finds ways, and you always love to see this, finds a way to get an extra couple of yards every single down, breaks tackles, he's got the speed to break away, he's elusive, great vision, no injury history as far as I'm aware, major yardage, has got to be the favorite for the Heisman, and, I think he's got a big, big future.
Just to give people a little bit more coming back to the area of Seattle. I have no idea how things are going at my alma mater, Washington State. I'm assuming pretty bad. But, with Mike Leach, despite it all, the thing of people that seem to, what they forget about those Texas Tech teams is that they actually played pretty good defense. We haven't really seen that at Washington State. The offense, was there with Connor Halliday. They had the record games and all that stuff. It doesn't really – it's a lot better to watch than Paul Wolf football, that's for sure. But is there hope for Washington State?
Yeah, there's hope. The thing is that, Mike Leach's system, and you mentioned the success at Texas Tech there. And, well, what did he get in the end? He got a defense that could do a job. I think that's basically it. There was not a stock full of NFL talent on that defense, but what he had is a system that was fine-tuned at that point, working well, and he had a stud like Michael Crabtree at receiver. And the system they want to use, and we talked about it a few moments ago, if you've got that guy that you can just throw the ball to pretty much every single time he snapped the ball, then it just helps so much. And I just think that maybe Washington State, and they've had a couple of good receivers during the Leach era so far, that just haven't delivered on the potential that they've got. And if he can find the guy that can be a real threat, and if he can get a quarterback who can, be like Graham Harrell did at Texas Tech, just not turn the ball over, make the huge yardage, but not turn it over in key areas. And if they can get a defense that can just frustrate a few teams, then they've got a chance. But, I think there's so many years into his reign now, and you kind of look at it and think, well, when are they going to take the next step? When are they going to be more than just a bottom dweller when are they going to be a team that can win as many games as it loses for a start? And until they get to that point, it's hard to be overly optimistic.
People have had optimism at Washington since Chris Peterson came over, but they also just lost 3 first-rounders. So do the Huskies have guys coming in to replace those guys, or was that sort of the end of their window?
I don't think they have. I can't say that I've studied the recruitment class that has just come through for Washington, but they lost some really good players. And I think that we'll notice how good the players are that they lost. They lost at least a couple of first-round picks on defense, and then 3 actually, because they lost Peters as well. He went in the first round, so 3 first-round picks on the defense. And that's really tough. And a second rounder in Kikaha, who, had loads of production, and, who's going to step up to the plate next? I like Peterson as a coach, and I like the fact that he waited for the right job. He didn't just jump when Boise State's little window kind of closed. He picked his job. He clearly knows what he's doing. Boise State are still competitive because of his legacy, and I think that is what Washington will have over the next few years. But first and foremost, they've just got to get a quarterback and some guys on offense because it's the offense that has been the issue, isn't it? The defense was great last year and worked well, but they just seemed like they couldn't get out of the way. They couldn't find a quarterback who could finish a game. And until they do, until they can get that security there, and that was what he had at Boise State, Peterson, was a quarterback he could rely on, who was as prolific as any in the country. And maybe doesn't need to have that, but he just needs someone who he knows is his starter, because I don't think he knew at any point last year who his best quarterback was.
Right. I just want to move on. We've talked briefly about the next NFL draft. We're still sort of trying to understand the last one, but you said before that you've read countless 2016 NFL mock drafts, which I think we use the word countless because you just don't want to know how many it is. You just want to keep that
It's
secret.
a lot.
It's a secret between you and your computer.
It's definitely in the tens.
Oh, man. Before we've even had, and how many of those names are some of them are going to be undrafted. The top pick might not even be anywhere mentioned, like you said, with your guy at Missouri. So, but one guy that's constantly mentioned at the top, third-year player at Ohio State, again, defensive tackle, defensive end, Joey Bosa. Can you talk a little bit about Bosa Nova?
Oh, yeah. I mean, his dad was not I didn't watch his dad. It was a bit before my time. But, his dad kind of failed in the NFL. And it just seems like this guy can't fail. I mean, he looks a bit like Chris Long when he was at Virginia. And he's just relentless off the edge. He's got great size, plays the run well, gets into the backfield. You were watching him last year. And when you kind of watch a player and you just say, yeah, put him in the NFL now. It's a waste of everybody's time to see him play another year of college football, get him in the next level. And unlike Jadeveon Clowney, who, exceptional athletic talent, and Joey Bosa is not Clowney in terms of physical quality, but what he is he's just ready. And you just know that whichever team ends up drafting this guy, and whether he goes in the top 1 or 2 picks is going to depend on how the quarterback situation plays out and who is picking first overall. But if he doesn't go in the top 5, I would be stunned. It would have to be a serious injury. He just looks the part, and he is an exceptional talent, great attitude. People are going to love him. Ohio State are going to have so many prospects who are going to go in the first 2 rounds, and he's going to lead the way. He should be the first, unless Cardale Jones just has a Heisman-winning year. But he's going to be one of several first-round picks for Ohio State.
How would you describe the draft as a whole? Because obviously Seahawks fans, it's good that we don't have to look forward to drafts, that we don't have to worry about who's going to go in the top 5. But at the same time, just like, how would you describe, let's just say the first round as you see it now, next year's first round? Is it comparable to the amazing 2011 first round? Is it as bad as the 2013 first round?
I think the best answer to give is I'm pretty optimistic on this class, at least in terms of like players who have a chance at, and it's very early, it's June, but players who with a great year can propel themselves into first round contention. We've talked about Harold Brantley there and Joey Bosa. There's several guys at Ole Miss, Robert Nkemdiche, who was a defensive end, who was compared to Jadeveon Clowney when he was a recruit. You've got Laramie Tunsil, who was a tackle, huge tackle. Could easily be a top 5 pick. He needs to come back from an injury. Laquan Treadwell, we talked about Ole Miss, fantastic. You've got a few cornerbacks, led by Vernon Hargreaves and Kendall Fuller. Sean Oakman's going to be in this class because he didn't declare last year. We're talking about a 6'8", 280-pound monster who, when he turns it on, is unstoppable. It's just whether or not he can be more consistent there. And there's a few wild cards. There's a whole host. I could list you about 5 offensive tackles who could go in the first round already, and that's with a chance for others to develop. Keep an eye on Carson Wentz, who's a quarterback at North Dakota State. He could be a small school guy who actually, a bit like Joe Flacco, ends up going in the first round, middle of the first somewhere. He's someone to keep an eye on. And there's guys who could develop too. I mean, there's one player who looked really good as a freshman was Marquez North at Tennessee. He was a big receiver. And kind of just to go along with the way that Tennessee has played, He's just gone backwards and backwards, and yet the talent is there for him to be a fantastic player. And if he was playing for Alabama right now as a replacement for I've forgotten his name. The guy went to Oakland in the end. If he was going in and starting for Alabama this year, then he would have a real chance to be really good. But
Cooper?
That's it, Amari Cooper, of course. So if he was there, he would have had a real chance to have a big year. But he's not. He's at Tennessee. Quarterback situation is still a mess. Can he go beyond that? I'm not too sure. And then there's others. You could go right down. I could list you tons and tons of players who've got a chance. Scooby Wright at Arizona is not just got a fantastic name. He's also just a production machine. He had 14 sacks, 163 tackles, and 29 tackles for a loss last year, and 6 forced fumbles. I mean, that's incredible. There are guys who don't have those numbers in 3 years.
Yeah.
So this is a player to keep an eye. And he owned the game when Arizona beat Oregon in Oregon. It was the Scooby Wright game, and he was he won the game for them. So he's a guy to keep an eye on as well.
You can't do me wrong if you Scooby Wright.
That's it.
This is random. Just a guy that just sort of popped in my head while you were listing off players, and I'm not exactly sure. I just remember the hype, and I just want to kind of curious about if he's living up to the hype. Leonard Fournette, the running back at LSU. I just remember a lot of people talking about him as the type of guy that didn't belong in college football for long. Is that something that's happening at LSU?
Yeah, I mean, he had real flashes last year, and obviously he's got a long way to go yet. But just when he turned it on, he was pretty special, And if considering it was his first year, and he had a few big games. I'm trying to remember the time. I remember watching the bowl game against Notre Dame, and I think that he had a big game, something like over 100 yards in about 10 carries. So he has a real chance of being a big-time prospect. There's the guy at Oklahoma as well who broke Melvin Gordon's record, who's sort of similar, huge, big, physical running back. The thing about Fournette is he's just so big and breaks tackles and has yet got the speed to go along with it. I mean, there are some really good running backs. I mean, it's almost like the Seahawks plan this type of thing, isn't it? That at a time when, in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, Marshawn Lynch is sadly going to call it a day sooner rather than later, that there is going to be several great college running backs coming into the league. And Seattle is going to have a chance, whether it's this upcoming year or the next year, they're going to get a good guy and they're going to have someone who can replace Beast Mode. Maybe not to the same level because you'll never replace him, but they're going to have a chance to keep things rolling with the running game.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest one to sort of face, is that when you talk about the 6 or 7 elite players that the Seahawks have, which is an insane thing to even consider, but when you talk about the elite great players that they have, Chancellor, Thomas, Sherman, Wilson, Lynch, now Jimmy Graham, and then moving on to Bennett, Bobby Wagner, and then to another extent, Cliff Averill and KJ Wright. But when you talk about all those guys, the one that seems like he could shut the window on his own is Marshawn Lynch. He really just seems like his own player that we've never seen before and that we may never see again. And that's going to be the one that's perhaps the toughest to replace, isn't it?
Yeah, and I don't think while he's playing, we really understand just how good he is. I mean, he, for me, is without a shadow of a doubt one of the top 10 players in the NFL at any position. I hope that he is recognized as such in the top 100 list, although in a list where I think J.J. Watt was 12th last year, I'm not overly optimistic on that. But yeah. Marshawn Lynch is just what a player. It's just a pleasure to watch him to play the game of football. The fact that he plays for the Seahawks as well just makes it all the better that you're not just admiring him from afar, you actually get a root for the guy. And it's incredible. I mean, there's never going to be another human being like this. And I truly believe, when people talk about, has he done enough to get in the Hall of Fame? I think if he retired today, he should be in the Hall of Fame, because there is just not a guy like this. And there's he's totally unique in every single way. And the fact that he's had runs that will define eras. I mean, like the Beastquake run is just, no one who ever watched that is ever going to forget that play. No. I can remember exactly what I was doing when I was watching that, in my front, I can picture it like it was yesterday. And, to think of moments like that He's going to be one of a kind.
Yeah, there's those moments. Those are the Hall of Fame players. Those guys that give you moments that will live on in NFL films, forever. That they should be 100 years from now, if they're having some ceremony to celebrate 150 years of Super Bowls or whatever, and they're talking about last 150 years. If that Beastquake isn't still top 10, I don't know what is. The fact that we can make it this far, and it's arguably, one of the top 5 plays that we've ever, sort of seen.
I think it's one of the top 5 things I've ever seen.
Yeah,
it's like it is just. I just think back to it now. Just that you never see anything like that.
And then when you think about the fact that when it wasn't just like a guy that had a moment, it was a guy that's if you took his top 10 plays, it's phenomenal. You could see the run he hit when he had a similar run against the Cardinals last year when he barreled over. Who were they playing, the Falcons or the Texans? I can't remember who was the one where he gained like 3 yards, or it was just that moment where he had pushed someone over like it was nothing on the sidelines. And then he's certainly one of the quintessential players that will define however long the Seahawks, success in this current period lasts. And so
you're talking about that. I actually watched the NFC Championship game, against the 49ers. I don't know why I watched it this week, but I was bored and I put it on. So I watched that, and there was one run, I think it was before the Hauschka kick, I think, to make the final score what it was. So it was the kick that put Seattle 6 points up in the fourth quarter. And Russell Wilson's a really hesitant handoff, and Marshawn Lynch has got it about 6 yards deep, and Aldon Smith's running down in the backfield. And you think, here we go, this is going to be a huge loss. We'll make the kick even harder for Hauschka. And Lynch just shoves Aldon Smith away with a stiff arm, just gets hold of his helmet and goes, get out the way, and then drags 2 tacklers for a 2-yard gain. And I was just watching the back, and it was out of all the great plays that happened and the tip and all that, watching that game back, that was probably my favorite play watching it this week, because it was just the best 2-yard run you will ever see. And only he could have done that.
It's not always, to be a player that is valuable in the NFL, in this sport, to have value, it's not just to be someone that necessarily, like you say, if he picks up 2 yards, or it's not necessarily just someone that gains the numbers or the stats or makes the catch, but if the other side has to account for you on every single play, when the Seahawks line up on offense, they're accounting for Marshawn Lynch first, and then second, they're wondering if Russell Wilson's going to run it second, and then after that, there really was nothing until they got Jimmy Graham. And so now what they've added, even in those games when Jimmy Graham has 20 yards and you're pissed for your fantasy team, they had to account for him. They might have had to put 3 guys on him. That opens up someone else that's going to be able to do something. So when it's out there and it's Marshawn Lynch, the fact that they have to put on, a certain number of their best players to account for a player like that, that's as valuable as anything else that you can have in this sport.
Yeah, and you know what? I always had a theory when during the Holmgren days that Seattle was a nice team, and you know what? If you got their best game, you were in trouble and stuff like that, especially in Seattle. But Seattle didn't have any players, and Alexander for a time maybe, but Seattle didn't have any players that the other team the week leading up to the game, they were thinking, oh my God, we've got to play this guy this week, and scared the crap out the other team's fans. And I always felt like if you were gonna win championships, especially if you were going to be a consistent challenger, you needed a few guys who you're thinking, oh no, how are we going to stop him? And you're talking about guys like an Aaron Rodgers. You're thinking about playing Rodgers, and you're thinking, oh, he's going to be key in this game, and JJ Watt and people like that. And Seattle under Pete Carroll have got guys who, do you know what? You're playing the Seahawks this week, and you're thinking, how the hell are we going to stop these guys? And you just reel the names off, all the great defensive talent. You're thinking, oh, how are they? Yeah. How are we going to score points? And then you're thinking, oh my God, we've got to stop Marshawn Lynch. But oh, do you know what? If Marshawn Lynch is having a quiet game, they've still got Russell Wilson who can beat you in every way. And then you've got Jimmy Graham thrown in there now. And nobody is thinking the week before the game, oh, do you know what? Who's playing center? And even if that might be an issue for Seattle in weeks 1 and 2, nobody is worrying about that.
Right.
No one's thinking, oh, that's a great positive for us the week before the game. They're worried. They're scared. crapless about the fact they've got to play Lynch, Wilson, Graham, all of that defensive talent. And that is the thing. Seattle has got so many players that scare opponents, fans, and teams, and you just got a game plan for them. And it is really difficult. And that's why they're the best team in the league.
Yeah, it'll be great if they can find, that wide receiver to make it 4, while Marshawn Lynch is still Marshawn Lynch. If they can find a wide receiver to be a threat on every play, in addition to Graham, Wilson, and Lynch, that'll put them over that top, I think, and then we'll really be able to. We're already watching something
if Percy Harvin wasn't a jerk, then they may have that.
Yeah. There's no reason to say that I guess the cap situation would have been tough, but there's no reason they could have still had the resources to get Jimmy Graham. And if you would have thought that Percy Harvin thing had worked out, if you could have put all these players together, it's just something that doesn't, when I go to the gym and I'm like, well, at a certain time, I can watch the NFL Network at the gym, and then at a certain time they play classic games, and they were playing a classic game with the Dallas Cowboys in the 90s, and it's like 1995, and and it's just like Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, Michael Irvin. When you have that many like Hall of Fame players playing together, that's when you get those special little pockets of history, and you got to believe that the Seahawks are in the middle of that pocket, and hopefully in the middle and not at the end. But to have that many great players playing together, it's reminiscent of teams like the Cowboys.
Yeah, it is. And do you know what? Whatever happens, and I hope, and I'm fairly confident, although I just hope that the defining moment of this Seahawks generation is not going to be that last Super Bowl play. But I just have a feeling that in about 10 years' time, we're going to look back on this, and hopefully Seattle has found a way to get a new generation of players and stay at the top. But we're going to look back on this era, and we're going to be pretty grateful that it existed. And if Seattle never wins another Super Bowl, I think they're going to contend for a few years more. And it's just going to be such a joy to watch this team continue. It already has been to see it grow, to see it win that first title, and to see it contend and come back, roaring back last year against the odds when people were saying they couldn't do it again, and they were that close to doing it again. This is going to be a real pleasure to watch this team, and we're just going to enjoy the ride. And it does. I feel like as the time has gone on, Kenny, since the Super Bowl, it's that thought that's comforted me the most, that this is not the end. This was not, they better win this game because they'll never be back here again. This wasn't an aging team at the end of its window. This is a team that's in its peak. And let's hope that they go back to that Super Bowl next year and make amends.
I think they will. It's been a little over 4 months since that Super Bowl, and about 3 months until the season starts. So we're over the hump, and before you know it, it'll be back. And we made it over an hour without talking about Russell Wilson's contract. So a pat on our backs for that. Rob, thank you so much for coming on and filling in for Dan.
Yeah, it was great to be Danny Kelly for a whole hour.
Thank you for being not Danny Kelly.
That's my pleasure anytime, Kenny.
And follow him at Rob Staton on Twitter, SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Obviously it's a slow time right now for the football drafting stuff, but
we'll be back
up soon. It's coming back. And me at Kenneth Arthur S, although I think I probably peaked on Twitter, so don't worry too much about that. And then you can still follow Danny at Field Goals, and of course come to fieldgoals.com and subscribe and rate us on iTunes for Real in the Field Goals. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.